Welcome to Big Ideas Made Simple. I'm Jess Weber, and I believe that the clearest people in any room are not always the smartest ones. They're just the ones who have figured out what they actually are here to do and stopped letting everything else pull them sideways. So, this show is about getting you there. And every episode, one big idea is stripped down to what actually matters and is handed to you in a way that you can use before we're even done here. So let's get into it with me for the last couple. If you've been with me for the last couple episodes, you'll already know what I'm planning on talking about. And if you just found this one, I want to give you the context to make it worth your time, even without the full backstory. So, 2 episodes ago, we talked about the container, that box that you've been trying to shove yourself into, even though you know that you don't fit. And then last episode, we talked about naming the thread or the pattern running through everything you've done through that container and everything else that you've built or taught or solved, and how it shows up regardless of a title or a room or even the context. And so at the end of the last episode, I made a point that naming the thread is the beginning, not your finish line. And that the move from having a thread to building something coherent and lasting is exactly where most people stall out. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So here's where I want to start, because I think most people, when they finally land on their thread, expect what comes next to be obvious. They think that clarity will just cascade. The decisions will make themselves, or the right opportunities will show up neatly, and the wrong ones will be incredibly easy to decline. But that is literally like never what happens. So, what I actually tend to see is this: you have a thread, you can feel it, you can say it out loud, but then life keeps moving exactly at the same pace it always has. Your inbox doesn't slow down, your opportunities don't come all packaged and labeled and color coded so that you know whether they're in alignment or the wrong direction. Your calendar is still begging to be filled with people around you who want your time or your energy or your ideas. So, naming that thread is not something that simplifies your life, but instead, it simplifies your relationship to life. And that's a completely different thing. Today, I want to talk about what it looks like to actually use that thread. So, not as a defining identity statement or a tagline or a website, but rather more as the thing that orients every decision or yes or even no, every room you choose to walk into and the ones that you choose to walk away from. Your thread is not your destination, it's directional. And once you learn how to let it pull you, everything else will start to fall into line. So I want to give you this visual that has been living rent free in my brain since I started thinking about this episode. And bear with me because it goes back to my teaching days and working in a preschool classroom. If you have ever tried to herd a group of small children anywhere, you know that it feels like herding kittens. Not cats. I mean like kittens. And so when schools are trying to move children safely from one room to the next or to the playground or something like that, they often use a rope. And that's not to like tie all of the kittens up together, right? But it's one long rope with handles or knots or loops or even small toys. And it gives a designated spot for each child to hold on to while the whole group moves forward. And so this can show up in such a funny way because it's never a straight line. And none of the kids are at the same pace. You've got your distractible ones and your fast moving ones and your ones that want to talk and socialize instead of move. But it tethers them together enough that that central rope, which is being held usually by a teacher in the front and a teacher in the back, can move them together from point A to point B. And so that visual of the chaos of preschool and that rope is what I think of when I think of a thread, your thread. And so here's why I love this image so much. That rope that I'm describing, it's not rigid or a piece of metal or some track that you like lock into, right? It allows all the kids to move and kind of ebb and flow their way naturally down the hall. And that momentum of the group is what keeps pulling them towards their destination. If one of the kids lets go immediately, the teachers will notice. And it helps give everybody really, truly that sense of direction. So when a kid lets go and has nowhere to orient themselves, that's what I imagine operating without a thread probably feels like. It's not chaotic, right? You're still relatively adjacent to everything, but it's like this low level ambient lostness. So like you might even still be moving along with the group. You're busy, you're producing things, but because you're not attached, you're not tethered to something, you have no idea whether all of those efforts are adding up to something coherent. And so this is the thing that I think gets missed in a lot of conversations around clarity or purpose or finding your thing, right? That rope is not something that stops you 100% from wandering. It's not going to make you immune from distraction or shiny objects or opportunities that look really good from a distance, but then pull you sideways the closer you get to them. You will still wander. You'll still be distracted, especially if you're wired the way that a lot of my listeners are wired, because your brain is likely making connections faster than most people in the room. And it gets genuinely excited about the things that are only tangentially related to what you probably set out to do in the first place. And so that thread doesn't fix it. What it does is it makes it come back more easily because you always know what you're coming back to, just like those kids with the central rope and the hand holder. That shift in framing matters more than it sounds because most high capacity people beat themselves up for wandering. They treat every distraction as evidence that they have not yet committed hard enough to the thing. And so I want to offer you a different interpretation. The wandering without the tether is the problem. It's not the wandering itself. Because when you have your named thread, your wander has a natural endpoint. You can drift and explore, right? You can follow something interesting for a while, but at some point you are going to feel that pull, right? The gentle tug back towards the thing you already know is true about yourself. And you adjust. I mean, it's not dramatic, just a little bit. Kind of like those preschoolers adjust when one child slows down and the rope gets pulled in a certain direction. The pull of the rope is not failure catching up with you. That is your thread doing its job. So, what does it look like to put thread thought into practice? Because I want this to land tactically for you and not just have it be something that sounds good and then evaporates the moment that you quit listening to me. So, here's what I've found. Once your thread is named, it becomes the orientation tool that you run every significant decision through. Not obsessively, not the way that requires you to do one of those journaling sessions every time somebody sends you an email, but just like that quick, honest gut check of does this move me closer to my North Star or away from it? And the reason this check works is because the thread touches every category of decision in your life and your business, not just like the major ones, but your small ones too. And so I want to walk you through how that actually works in a sequence because I do believe that the order of operations matters. And that's not just because I used to be a math teacher. So it starts with what you build because the most foundational expression of your thread is what you are choosing to create. It's what makes you unique. And so once you know what you are put on this planet to produce, the question of what to build next stops being overwhelming and starts being more answerable. So you're not asking arbitrarily, what should I create next? You're asking, what format does my thread want to take in this season? So the podcast you're listening to right now, that was the decision for me, right? My keynote is the same decision. The work I'm building around helping people organize their communities and their IP and find a path through their information to an outcome for their clients, that is that same decision. Those things that I just mentioned, they're not separate. They're not competing with each other or competing for my attention. They are the same underlying function asking to show up in different context. And here's where building leads naturally into your next decision category, which to me is pricing. Because the way that you value your work is inseparable from how clearly you understand what it actually is. So when you're vague on your thread, pricing is going to feel arbitrary. You scan what other people charge, study the market, check your top competition, or worry about being too expensive or not expensive enough. You are potentially discounting preemptively because you're not confident in what you're asking for and the work that you're offering. But when your thread is named and the build is clear, the pricing conversation will change completely. You are not asking, oh, what's the going rate in the market? You're asking, what is this specific function worth to the person who needs it most in the moment? And so once you are building something and you know how to identify what it's worth, that third decision category becomes clearer too. And that's, who should you be connecting with? Because the thread doesn't just tell you what to create or what to charge. It's telling you whose orbit you probably belong in. So you stop trying to optimize for impressive and you start optimizing for aligned. You are not asking who is the most strategic person in the room. You are asking who in this room is moving in the same direction that I'm moving towards. That is a completely different question, which will probably find you different people. When you have that question, it can lead into that fourth category, which is honestly the one that I find probably the most interesting, which is, which rooms do you choose to show up in before you know what's waiting completely in the room for you? Because the thread does not help you just make clean decisions when your ROI is obvious, but it gives you the confidence to walk into rooms where the outcome might not be completely visible. So saying yes to something that looks sideways on paper, because the alignment is real, even if the return on the time or money investment is not yet measurable. And that's a different kind of trust that is only available when the thread is so clear that you can feel whether something is pulling you towards your North Star or away from it. The last category, where all of those four that I just named come together, is the no. specifically the no that has a cost. The no to something that looks like opportunity, or the no to someone whose name carries weight, the no to the path that seemed like the next logical step for you because you didn't have a named thread. Without your pattern, that no is just a preference or an instinct or a gut feeling that you can't fully defend. With your thread, it becomes a position. So you can very quickly and specifically identify whether a particular opportunity will move you towards your North Star or away from it, even when it's probably hard to say out loud or might cost you something in the short term, or when that person at the other end of the conversation can't quite understand why you're walking away from something that looks good on paper. The thread makes the no not just possible, but clean. And a clean no is one of the most powerful things you can offer yourself as someone who is building something that is genuinely yours. So, those are the 5 categories: build, price, connect, show up, and say no. But I don't want to leave you with just a list. I want you to have something that you can actually use and run with. So, here's the tactical version. Anytime you are presented with a decision that feels complicated or sticky, or like you've been avoiding making it, ask yourself 3 questions in this order. 1, does it let me be more fully what my thread says I am? Or does it ask me to compress part of myself to fit into somebody else's container? Secondly, is the person in the room or the opportunity on the other side moving in the same direction that I am? And then thirdly, if I say yes to this, what else do I have to say no to? That third question is the one that most people skip because it forces you to see that every yes has a built-in no somewhere else. And when you run it against the thread, the trade-off usually becomes very clear very quickly. It's not the thing where you need a pro-con list or a spreadsheet, a strategy session. You just need 3 questions and the honesty to sit with what comes up when you actually ask them of yourself. I want to tell you 2 stories because I think they do something together that neither of them can do on their own. One is about a thread helping me say yes, and the other is helping me say no. And I think you need both to understand what the thread actually does when it's working so you can kind of compare and contrast them. So the first one, I was approached with what genuinely looked like an incredibly exciting opportunity. A large organization that I have a lot of respect for reached out and said, hey, we have this existing audience who is begging for more educational content. And we would love for you to write some pitches for some classes that you would be able to teach live. You would be able to market them. You would own them, all of the things. And we'll present them to this large audience with our name on it, but also highlight you. And on the surface, that didn't sound like a bad deal at all, right? Especially for somebody who loves building and teaching and not so much lead generating and leveraging this massive, community and platform. So reach can be valuable, and not having to do all of that myself felt valuable. But after the initial pitch, I started sitting there doing the math. And what I recognized was 50% of the revenue was gone before I'd even done the work. And I was still responsible for a significant portion of sales, of marketing, of lead generation. The reach was there casually, but it wasn't proactively finding me clients or students or however you want to name them. I was essentially paying 50% of my own curriculum, and I wasn't getting really anything for it. It was more the privilege of building for them and being able to attach my name to them. And so when I ran that opportunity through those questions and I hit the second one, is this moving in the same direction I'm moving in? The honest answer was no. Because building courses inside a specific platform would have positioned me specifically in that industry and that space. And I have spent years deliberately trying to not be labeled as that person or that industry, that title, right? That container. Not because there's anything wrong with it. I have tons of roots in it and I have respect for it, but it's not who I want to be known as. I want to be known as Jess Weber, not Jess Weber of this industry, this company, this role. And that distinction mattered enormously to me for where I want to build my career, where I want to take big ideas made simple. And when I went back to the questions and thought even about the third question in the context of this, if I said yes, what was I saying no to? And the answer was big ideas made simple. Because if you taught for this platform and wrote curriculum or a course for them, it became theirs legally. And so all of the content and things that I wanted to build for myself could no longer be mine. And I decided that it was so important that it stay mine so that I could use it in the highest level of service to my North Star that I wanted to, which led me to the answer of no. And it wasn't immediate or without effort. I actually built out multiple course pitches and ideas and outlines before I actually stepped back to look at the whole picture. And I think that's so important to name because saying no to something you have already invested in is harder than saying no to something that you've never started. But I had my thread, I had my pattern, and I had those three questions. When I was honest with myself, the answer was clear. Now, the second story on the other side, and this one is about that yes that might not have looked like it had an art. I have been, stepping into this space of speaking and training more and more each year. And I submitted an inquiry to speak at an event. I pitched a keynote, a breakout session, and I put real thought into both of those because I felt like my message was genuinely aligned with the audience that would be in those rooms. I got a no for the speaking slot, but they came back and they did offer me a sponsorship booth instead. A sponsor booth when you pitch a keynote is definitely not the same thing for anybody who's in this industry. It feels like it's very much not the opportunity you were asking for. Most often, I feel like people would say, thanks, but no thanks. If I'm not on the stage, I'm out, right? But I ran it back through my questions again and I said, does this let me be fully more what I felt like I am headed towards and who I want to be? And the answer is yeah. The audience is right. The conversations that I would have from the booth were completely aligned with what I was building. The people in the room were moving in the same direction I was moving in. So I said yes. I set up the booth and I showed up. And across the hallway from me was another sponsor. We started talking the way you do when you're both standing at your respective tables waiting for the hallway to fill up between sessions. Turns out that he's organizing another event. And that's happening actually a few weeks from now. After conversations, we recognized that one of my keynotes was exactly what he was looking for. So I pitched him right there in that hallway, and he said yes. Now I have the opportunity to be the opening keynote to an incredible event focused on alignment with who I am and what I'm building and a room full of my ideal clients. And the beauty of that is it didn't happen because I knew he was going to be there and I knew he was going to be across from me. And that was like the most strategic of plays that I could have made. But it happened because I was tethered. And that thread told me to be in the room even when the room didn't offer me what I asked for originally. And that room put me across the hallway from the right person for the right moment. And then that has led to even more opportunities. That is not something I could have engineered, but I can create conditions for it. And the thread is how I knew which rooms to be in and which ones were worth being in before I could even see the outcome. So, two totally different decisions funneled through the same thread and the same three questions. One helped me say no to something that looked like a massive opportunity, but would have compressed everything that I was building into somebody else's box. And the other helped me say yes to something that looked like a consolation prize, but turned out to be exactly what I needed in the moment. Again, same three questions both times. And because I had my thread, I could trust the answer even if it felt a little uncomfortable. So here is your one thing this week. And I want to make it as specific as possible because this is not something that you find by thinking harder in a quiet room. It's something you actually have to run. So look at the decisions sitting in front of you right now. Not your abstract future ones, but the ones actually in your inbox or your text thread or your calendar or just in the back of your mind that you've been avoiding. Pick one and ask the three questions in order. Does this let me be more fully what my thread says I am, or am I compressing part of myself to fit someone else? Is the person or the room or the opportunity on the other side of this moving in the same direction I am? And if I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? That's the entire thing. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. And what you'll probably find is that some decisions you've been sitting on for weeks become obvious the moment that you run them through it. The no that felt complicated becomes clean. And the yes you were so nervous about finds its footing. The thing that you've been avoiding because you were not sure that it was worth the risk suddenly has a very different kind of evidence behind it. You might also find some decisions that are genuinely hard even after you run the check, because alignment is not the same as easy. Sometimes the most aligned move is an uncomfortable one. Sometimes the thread pulls you towards something that requires real courage or real investment or the real willingness to show up before the outcome is guaranteed. That is not your check failing. That is your check working exactly the way it's supposed to, pointing you towards your North Star and leaving the rest of the work to you. You are still going to wander. It's not a flaw. That is being human. But now you have something in your hand to come back to. And the more consistently you use it, the more instinctive the pull becomes. Until one day you realize that you're not even running the check anymore because the thread and the decision have become the same thing. You have become coherent enough that the orientation just happens. And that's what I hope you're building towards. Not perfection, coherence. The kind that compounds quietly over time. Because the thread isn't a destination, it's a direction. So go use it. That's it for today's episode of Big Ideas Made Simple. If this one gave you something you can actually use, I would love to know about it. Come find me over at bigideasmadesimple.com. That's where my newsletter lives, where you can connect with me directly. And I can even send you my guide on making the leap between AI tools without losing your own voice in the process. Every week, I send one idea to your inbox and nothing else. So I'll ask this. If you know somebody sitting on a decision right now, trying to figure out whether something is worth saying yes to or finally saying no to, send them this episode. The thread works whether or not they have listened to the last 2 episodes. This one, I believe, stands on its own. And I can't wait to see you in the next one. Thanks for listening.